I think I didn't do anything wrong, just slept on a couch after too many drinks. But the moment my husband saw the address where I spent the night, he called it betrayal. Hours later, I was staring at divorce papers stamped with his lawyer's seal. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The night it happened started like a blur and ended in a storm I never saw coming. Naomi had dragged me out for drinks after a long week, saying I needed to loosen up, that Deacon had been making me too tense with his serious ways. One cocktail became 3, and 3 somehow became 6, until I found myself laughing too loudly, leaning on Evan for support, the ex I always swore was nothing but a relic of my past. When Naomi suggested we call it tonight, Evan offered me his couch, saying it was safer than stumbling home. I told myself it was harmless, that it was easier than waking Deacon at midnight with the smell of alcohol on my clothes. I passed out there, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of engine grease and aftershave, convincing myself that nothing happened, that nothing could be held against me. But the next morning, when I crept back into our house, Deacon was standing in the kitchen with Clara eating cereal at the table. His eyes went straight to the address on the rideshare receipt I had carelessly left open on my phone. He didn't shout at first, but the silence that filled the kitchen was heavy. He asked where I had been, and I told him I stayed at Naomi's, but when he raised his eyebrow, I quickly added that Naomi wasn't feeling well, so Evan had offered his couch. His face hardened, his voice quiet but sharp as he said, spending the night at an ex's place wasn't something a married woman did. I laughed nervously, waving my hand, telling him he was paranoid, that I was drunk and it meant nothing. Clara looked between us with wide eyes. Spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and Deacon didn't press further. He just picked up his keys and said he was taking her to school early. By the time Naomi came over later, I had already spun the story in my head. I told her Deacon had overreacted, that he was sulking like a child. She laughed, saying men loved to play the victim, that it was good I didn't let him bully me with guilt. Her encouragement made me feel bold, so I texted him, saying he was embarrassing himself, that everyone would think he was insecure if he told them. He didn't reply, which only fueled my anger. I poured more wine than I should have and muttered to Naomi that silence was his favorite weapon, but I wouldn't let him win. That weekend, Margaret and Paul invited us for dinner, and I thought maybe Deacon would calm down once he was around his family. Instead, the moment we arrived, Margaret pulled him aside, and I caught the way she whispered with tight lips. At the table, she asked openly if it was true I had stayed at Evan's place. My cheeks burned, but I forced a laugh, saying yes, but it was innocent, that only a controlling husband would call that cheating. Margaret's eyes narrowed, Paul looked away, and Deacon kept his gaze fixed on his plate. I laughed louder to fill the silence, teasing Deacon for being old-fashioned, claiming he wanted to trap me in some outdated idea of marriage. Naomi, who had joined us for support, chuckled on cue, but even she looked uncertain when Margaret leaned forward and said, "A mother knew the difference between an accident and betrayal." I snapped back, saying Margaret had always hated me, that she was twisting everything to make me look bad. I told the table it was ridiculous to think a couch and a blanket meant infidelity. My voice rose, my laughter sharper, and still Deacon said nothing. He finished his food quietly, stood up, and announced he was leaving. He picked Clara up, excused himself politely, and walked out without another word. The calmness in his voice chilled me more than anger ever could. Naomi shifted uncomfortably beside me, whispering that maybe he just needed time. Margaret shook her head, muttering that time wouldn't change the truth. Back home, I tried to confront Deacon, asking why he kept running away instead of talking. He said only one thing, that trust wasn't a game. His voice was low, steady, and then he closed the nursery door behind him while Clara slept. I stood in the hallway, seething, telling myself he was punishing me unfairly, that he wanted to make me feel guilty for nothing. I called Naomi again, ranting that he was using silence to control me, that he was making me out to be the villain when I had done nothing wrong. Naomi murmured comfort, but her tone was weaker now, her words less certain. She said quietly that maybe I should have just come home instead of crashing at Evan's. I snapped at her, accusing her of turning against me, and she quickly changed the subject. That night, I poured another glass of wine and sat staring at the framed family photo on the wall. Deacon's face looked calm in it, steady, dependable, the same expression he wore at the dinner table before walking out. Clara's smile in the picture made my stomach twist, but I told myself again it was just a couch, just a blanket, just one night, nothing more. Still, the silence of the house pressed on me, heavier than laughter could mask, and for the first time, I wondered if Deacon's quiet wasn't retreat, but strategy. I whispered to myself that he was paranoid, that he would never follow through with his threats. Yet even as I said it, the image of him calmly walking out with Clara burned in my mind, like a warning I didn't want to face. The next few days I told myself everything was fine, that Deacon would eventually let go of his sulking, that he was only trying to scare me with silence. I went to work smiling wider than usual, chatting with co-workers like nothing was wrong, even pulling out photos of Clara to show how happy she looked. But whispers had already started making their rounds. Melissa, one of the younger nurses, leaned over to me at the desk and said she heard I had stayed at my ex's place. Her tone was casual, but her eyes sharp. I laughed immediately, brushing it off, saying people loved to twist stories, that it was just one night on a couch, nothing more. She smiled politely, but I caught her exchanging glances with another nurse, and I knew the gossip had already settled in their minds. I muttered under my breath that Deacon must have been the one spreading it, that he wanted to embarrass me. When I came home that evening, Deacon was in the nursery reading to Clara. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had unnerved me since the fight. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and told him people at work already knew, that he was humiliating me by running to everyone with half-truths. He didn't even look up from the book. He simply turned the page, his voice low and gentle for Clara. I tried to provoke him, saying he was weak, that only insecure men called their wives cheaters for sleeping on a couch. Still, he didn't rise to it. That quiet burned more than shouting ever would. The next Saturday, Margaret invited us again, and I convinced myself this was my chance to set things straight. I dressed carefully, painted on a confident smile, and even rehearsed lines about how ridiculous the rumors were. But the moment I walked through the door, I felt the chill. Margaret's lips were pressed tight, Paul gave me a polite nod, and Deacon stayed close to Clara, keeping his hand on her shoulder like she needed protection. Over dinner, Margaret asked bluntly if I thought it was fair for Deacon to wake up alone while I was asleep at another man's place. I laughed, louder than necessary, saying she made it sound scandalous when it was nothing but exhaustion and wine. I told her only paranoid people thought a blanket and a couch meant betrayal. Naomi, who had come with me for backup, laughed along, insisting that some families loved to invent drama. But Margaret's face didn't soften. She said clearly that intentions mattered less than appearances, that every person who heard the story would assume the worst. Her voice was cold, sharp, and for once Paul nodded in agreement. I felt the eyes around the table weigh on me, so I raised my voice, accusing Margaret of never liking me, of twisting Deacon against me. I mocked Deacon for sitting there in silence, claiming he was too cowardly to defend himself, too weak to admit he was paranoid. Naomi tried to support me, but even her voice wavered. The laughter I forced into the air sounded brittle, like glass ready to crack. Deacon finally set down his fork, wiped his mouth and stood up. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even meet my eyes. He lifted Clara gently from her chair, told his parents thank you for dinner, and walked toward the door. Clara clutched her stuffed bear, her eyes wide but calm, as if she already understood something I refused to see. Margaret shook her head, muttering that truth couldn't be buried under laughter. Paul stayed silent, his shoulders heavy. Naomi whispered to me that maybe I should just apologize, but I snapped back that apologizing meant admitting I had done something wrong. I called Deacon dramatic as the door closed behind him, pretending his exit meant nothing, but inside, my chest heightened, the calm in his voice echoing louder than my laughter. Back at home, the silence stretched into walls. He slept in the guest room that night, the baby monitor on his side of the bed instead of mine. I tried to confront him in the hallway, accusing him of trying to make me look unfit, of brainwashing Clara with his cold distance. He looked at me for a long moment and simply said that trust had been broken. His voice was steady, almost sorrowful, and then he closed the guest room door. I stood outside it, furious, shouting through the wood that he was paranoid, insecure, weak. My words echoed back at me in the stillness, unanswered. The next morning, I called Naomi again, venting about how Deacon was punishing me unfairly, how he wanted to make me the villain. She told me I was right, that men often use silence as control, but her tone lacked the confidence it once carried. When I pressed her, she hesitated, asking if maybe spending the night at Evans had been a mistake after all. Her words hit me like betrayal, and I lashed out, accusing her of switching sides, of letting Margaret poison her. Naomi backtracked quickly, saying she was only tired, but I knew a crack had formed in her loyalty. At the clinic, whispers grew louder. Melissa made a pointed comment about exes always finding their way back, and another coworker chuckled behind her. I forced myself to laugh along, saying they had no idea how secure my marriage was, that Deacon just liked to sulk. But the laughter in the hallway followed me all afternoon, and when I finally got home, Deacon was once again in the nursery, calm, steady, reading aloud while Clara's small hand clutched his sleeve. I stood in the doorway, my own laughter ringing hollow in my ears. For the first time, I realized it wasn't just silence I was up against, it was preparation. I tried to convince myself Deacon's silence meant weakness, that he was sulking because he had no ground to stand on. But the longer it stretched, the more it felt like he was building something I couldn't see. Each evening, he disappeared into the office after putting Clara to bed. I'd hear the quiet hum of the printer, the shuffle of papers, the steady scratch of a pen. I told myself he was burying himself in work, but deep down, I knew those weren't just office files. Once, when I peeked through the half-open door, I saw my own text messages printed out, my words highlighted in yellow. He looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. I smirked and said he must be desperate if he needed to twist private jokes into evidence. He didn't respond, just slipped the papers into a neat folder and closed the drawer. The silence was worse than any argument. I went to Naomi for reassurance. Sitting in her kitchen, I poured out everything, telling her Deacon was building a case against me, like a lawyer preparing for trial. She shook her head, saying maybe he just needed proof for himself, that he wouldn't really take it further. I reminded her of the dinner, of the way Margaret had looked at me, the way Paul had sighed, the way Deacon had walked out without a word. Naomi frowned, admitting it didn't look good, but then forced a laugh, saying I couldn't let them scare me. I clung to her words, even though they felt thinner than before. At work, the whispers turned sharper. Melissa avoided eye contact, and I overheard two nurses saying Deacon was better off without me. My cheeks burned, but I laughed loudly, saying Deacon would never leave, that men like him were too dependent on women like me. The laughter sounded convincing enough to them, but when I turned away, my chest felt hollow. I texted Deacon, accusing him of spreading gossip, of trying to ruin my reputation. Hours later, when he finally replied, it was a single line. The truth doesn't need gossip. The simplicity of it froze me. That weekend, Margaret and Paul stopped by unannounced. I opened the door with a forced smile, but Margaret pushed past me, her voice cutting. She said Deacon had shown them messages, posts, even statements from people at my clinic. My heart pounded, but I laughed it off, insisting he was twisting everything, that he was painting me as unstable. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply said I had chosen humiliation as a weapon, and now was shocked it cut me too. Paul stood behind her, silent, his disappointment more painful than anger. I shouted after them as they left that they were meddling, that Deacon was weak for hiding behind his parents. But when I slammed the door shut, the house felt emptier than ever. That night, I tried to force Deacon into a fight. I followed him into the office, demanding to know what he was planning. He kept his head down, stacking documents into orderly piles. I grabbed one, waving it in his face, shouting that no judge would care about jokes or a couch. He calmly took it back, slid it into the folder, and locked the drawer. His voice was steady when he said, Clara deserved better than games. I mocked him, calling him dramatic, saying he was using our daughter as a pawn. He didn't flinch, just told me that children noticed more than I realized, that Clara's teacher had already commented on her change in behavior. My throat tightened, but I scoffed, saying teachers always exaggerated. He didn't argue further. He simply walked past me, leaving me shouting into the silence. The next morning, Naomi came over, but she seemed uneasy. She asked if it was true Deacon had spoken to a lawyer. I froze, then forced a laugh, saying it was only a scare tactic, that he'd never go through with it. She didn't smile. She said quietly that if he really had evidence, I needed to be careful. I snapped at her, accusing her of doubting me, of letting his family manipulate her too. She tried to calm me, but the rift between us widened with every word. When she finally left, I knew I could no longer count on her the way I once had. That evening, I caught Deacon in the hallway with Clara's backpack, carefully tucking papers into a side pocket. I asked what he was doing, and he said calmly that he was keeping things organized for meetings. My stomach knotted, but I laughed bitterly, accusing him of pretending to be the hero while tearing our family apart. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said Clara would one day understand why he had chosen this path. His quiet certainty terrified me more than any threat. I sat in the living room afterward, staring at the mantel where Clara's photo smiled back at me. The house was filled with silence. Deacon reading to Clara upstairs, the faint sound of his printer whirring, my own glass clinking against the table. I whispered to myself that it was all nothing, that Deacon was bluffing, that he couldn't really mean to go through with divorce. But deep down, I felt the weight of his calm, steady actions pressing in. My laughter was no longer enough to cover it. For the first time, I wondered if he had already won before I even realized the game had started. The breaking point came at a family barbecue hosted by Paul in their backyard. The kind of gathering that usually felt casual and light, but this time was heavy with unspoken tension. I arrived with Clara, determined to smile, determined to show everyone that nothing was wrong, that Deacon's silence meant nothing. I carried a tray of desserts, forced laughter into my greetings, and told anyone who asked that Deacon was simply working late. But Margaret saw straight through me. She pulled Deacon aside as soon as he arrived, her eyes darting toward me with disapproval, sharp enough to slice through my false cheer. When we sat at the long picnic table, the silence stretched so tightly that I filled it with chatter about the clinic, about Clara's milestones, anything that could keep eyes off me. But Margaret wouldn't let it go. She leaned across the table and asked in a steady voice if I truly thought sleeping at an ex's apartment was harmless. My fork froze midair, but I quickly threw my head back in laughter, insisting it had been one night, one couch, one blanket, and nothing more. I called Deacon paranoid, told her she was encouraging his insecurities, and mocked the idea that adults couldn't be trusted around their past. The laughter felt brittle even to me, but I pushed it harder, turning to Naomi for backup. She gave a small chuckle, though her eyes shifted nervously. The others stayed quiet. Clara stared at me with wide eyes, clutching her bear, and I smiled at her, telling her Daddy was just being silly. Deacon remained calm, slicing food into small pieces for Clara, never raising his voice, never interrupting me. That silence unnerved me more than Margaret's words. I needed him to argue, needed something to twist, but he gave me nothing. I filled the air with louder laughter, saying he had no backbone, that he wanted to play the victim. Still, he sat steady, and the calmness in his face only made me burn hotter. Paul finally spoke, his voice low and steady, saying appearances mattered, that children picked up on more than parents thought. His words hit harder than Margaret's, because Paul rarely spoke against me. I snapped at him, accusing him of siding with Margaret as always, insisting they were trying to paint me as unfit. My voice rose, my hands gestured wildly, while Deacon spoon-fed Clara quietly, his calmness a stark contrast to my flailing performance. The imbalance made me furious. I turned to Naomi, begging her to tell them Deacon was overreacting. She hesitated, then said softly that maybe it hadn't looked good, that maybe I should have just gone home. I froze, my mouth open in shock. Naomi, my ally, was slipping away. I lashed out, accusing her of betrayal, of letting Margaret poison her too. She raised her hands, saying she wasn't taking sides, but the damage was done. My laughter returned, sharper than ever, filling the space with cruel jokes about how paranoid men ruined marriages. Nobody laughed with me. Deacon finally set down his fork, wiped his mouth, and stood. He lifted Clara from her chair, her small arms curling around his neck, and said calmly that they were leaving. His voice was steady, controlled, without an ounce of anger. That calm finality shattered me more than shouting could have. He thanked his father, nodded at Margaret, and walked out without glancing in my direction. The door shut behind him, and the silence he left behind was suffocating. I tried to recover, laughing loudly, saying he was dramatic, that he always loved to storm out and play the martyr. Margaret leaned toward me, her voice sharp as a blade, and said I had mocked him enough that soon I would see what real consequences looked like. Paul shook his head, muttering that he was tired of watching me destroy what little trust remained. Naomi sat frozen, eyes lowered, her discomfort obvious. I raised my glass defiantly, saying I was still the one with control, but the tremor in my hand betrayed me. Back home, the house felt emptier than ever. Deacon hadn't returned, and when I called, he didn't answer. I left angry voicemails, accusing him of abandoning me, of brainwashing Clara, of using silence to torture me. Each message was more frantic than the last, but none were returned. I stomped through the house, muttering to myself that he was weak, that he was trying to make me break first. I called Naomi again, but this time she didn't pick up. The sudden distance from her hurt more than I wanted to admit. My laughter echoed against the walls, hollow and sharp, failing to mask the fear building inside me. The next morning, I found a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter with my name on it. Inside were copies of Clara's school report and a note from her teacher about her withdrawn behavior, her quietness, her anxious eyes. I slammed the paper down, insisting to myself that teachers exaggerated, that Deacon had manipulated the situation, but the careful handwriting describing Clara's sadness felt undeniable. My chest tightened, but I forced a bitter laugh, telling myself it was just another tactic in his game. Still, the quiet house around me whispered a different truth. Deacon wasn't just sulking anymore. He was preparing. That night, I poured another glass of wine and stared at the mantel where Clara's photo stood. My laughter echoed weakly in the silence, the sound of a woman trying to convince herself she hadn't already lost. The image of Deacon calmly walking out with Clara replayed again and again in my mind. His silence was no longer retreat. It was victory, piece by piece, built with calmness where my laughter collapsed. The day the envelope arrived, I knew the silence had finally turned into something solid, something I couldn't laugh away. It was delivered by courier, thick with documents, my name typed neatly on the front. I ripped it open, expecting maybe another teacher's note, but instead found a formal petition filed through the courts. Deacon had moved forward with legal separation and custody arrangements. The words blurred as I read phrases like, "in the best interest of the child," and "establishing parental stability." My stomach churned, but I told myself it was just intimidation, just another attempt to make me feel small. I called Naomi immediately, voice shaking with rage, but she answered quietly, her tone careful. She said maybe Deacon wasn't bluffing. Maybe he really meant to protect Clara. I screamed at her for doubting me, accused her of betraying me, and hung up before she could say more. That evening, I stormed into Deacon's office, waving the documents in his face, demanding to know how he could do this to me. He sat calmly at his desk, files neatly stacked in front of him. He didn't shout, didn't flinch. He just said, Clara deserved peace, not games. I mocked him, calling him dramatic, telling him no judge would ever care about me sleeping on a couch. Without a word, he slid a folder toward me. Inside were printed screenshots of my texts to Naomi, the ones where I bragged about pushing Deacon's limits, mocking him for being paranoid, laughing about how insecure he looked. My throat tightened as I read my own words highlighted in yellow. I laughed bitterly, insisting they were just jokes, but the sound came out sharp, broken. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into the law office with my lawyer, chin held high. I told myself it was all show, that Deacon wanted to scare me. But when I saw him sitting there with his lawyer, calm and steady, I felt my confidence falter. His lawyer began first, presenting affidavits from co-workers who had overheard me laughing about Evan, bragging about how Deacon was too insecure to handle it. My stomach twisted as their words were read aloud, turning my laughter into daggers. I leaned toward my lawyer, hissing that it was all gossip, but even he looked unsure. Then came the texts, projected on a screen, my words glowing larger than life. Messages where I called Deacon paranoid, where I joked that staying at Evan's place kept things interesting, where I admitted to Naomi that I wanted to see Deacon squirm. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. I forced myself to laugh, saying everyone exaggerated in private chats, but the judge's expression didn't soften. My laughter fell flat, brittle in the stillness. Next, they presented Clara's teacher's report. It described her as withdrawn, hesitant, less talkative in class. Her once bright confidence dimmed. I clenched my fists, muttering that children go through phases, that teachers love to dramatize. But the words emotional withdrawal echoed in the room, undeniable. Margaret sat behind Deacon, her face calm but cold, her eyes locked on me like she was watching justice unfold. Naomi was there too, her head lowered, avoiding my gaze. Her silence stung more than Margaret's contempt. When it was my turn, I launched into a performance. I told the judge Deacon was controlling, that he had twisted every detail to punish me, that I was the victim of paranoia. I insisted sleeping on a couch wasn't cheating, that I had done nothing wrong. I laughed loudly, saying the whole thing was absurd, that adults didn't need babysitters, but each word sounded smaller, weaker, next to Deacon's calm presence. My lawyer tried to argue on my behalf, but his voice lacked conviction. It was my own words, my own laughter, that stood against me. Finally, Deacon spoke. His voice was steady, almost gentle, as he explained he wasn't seeking revenge, only stability for Clara. He said he had endured humiliation, had been mocked publicly, but had stayed silent until Clara's well-being was at stake. He said children deserved honesty, security, not parents who treated trust like a joke. His words didn't cut with anger, they weighed with reason. Compared to his calm dignity, I sounded like chaos. The judge announced preliminary rulings. Deacon would take primary custody, with me limited to supervised visitation. He would oversee Clara's finances, ensuring her needs were met without risk. My chest burned, but I forced a smirk, whispering to myself that it wasn't final. that I could still win. Yet when I looked at Deacon, holding Clara's photo in his hand, steady and unshaken, I knew the ground had shifted completely. Back home, I threw the documents across the table, staring at them through blurred vision. The words "temporary custody granted" glared back at me. I whispered that Deacon was paranoid, that everyone had overreacted, that it was only one night, one couch, nothing more. But the laughter that slipped from my lips sounded jagged, hollow, more like sobbing than humor. The silence of the house closed in around me, heavier than before. Deacon had turned patience into power, and I was left clutching empty words. The final court date arrived on a grey morning, the kind that seemed to drain color from everything. I walked in clutching my lawyer's arm, repeating to myself that it was still just a misunderstanding, that Deacon had exaggerated, that the judge would see I wasn't guilty of anything real. I straightened my dress, forced a confident smile, and told myself I was still in control. But when I stepped into the courtroom and saw Deacon sitting calmly at the table, papers organized in neat stacks, his mother and father behind him, my stomach sank. He looked steady, collected, as if he had already accepted the outcome. I told myself he was bluffing, but the silence in his eyes said otherwise. The judge began by reviewing the evidence once more. Every piece felt like a hammer driving the same nail deeper. Statements from co-workers, describing how I had laughed at Deacon and joked about staying at Evans. Screenshots of my messages to Naomi. My own words mocking Deacon's paranoia, bragging that I could push him as far as I wanted. My social media posts, projected in front of everyone, where I had joked that marriage needed adventure and that drunk nights were part of freedom. Then the teacher's report about Clara, describing her hesitation in class, her withdrawn behavior, her sadness that seemed heavier than her years. My laughter, my excuses, all of it lined up against me like walls closing in. When it was my turn, I stood tall and told the court that Deacon was trying to punish me, that he was twisting a harmless night into betrayal, that I had done nothing but make an independent choice. I said Adrian's couch meant safety, not sin, and that only a controlling man would turn that into grounds for divorce. My voice grew louder as I spoke, sharper, desperate to drown out the silence. I laughed too, claiming it was absurd that adults couldn't trust each other, but each laugh echoed emptily in the courtroom, brittle and hollow. The judge didn't smile, the clerk didn't look up, and Deacon didn't flinch. Then Deacon spoke. His words were calm, measured, not dripping with venom like I expected. He said he wasn't here for revenge, that he wasn't trying to destroy me, but that he could not allow Clara to live in a home built on lies and mockery. He said he had endured humiliation in silence, but once it touched their daughter, silence was no longer an option. He spoke of responsibility, of dignity, of wanting Clara to grow up knowing honesty and respect. His voice never rose, but each sentence carried weight, making my laughter sound like static by comparison. The judge delivered the ruling with the same cold finality I had once dismissed as impossible. Deacon was granted full custody of Clara, with me allowed supervised visitation. He was granted financial control to secure her care, ensuring her stability above all. The divorce was to proceed, with assets divided according to his lawyer's carefully prepared petition. My stomach twisted as the words "granted" and "approved" repeated again and again. I tried to smirk, to whisper that it wasn't final, but the papers handed to me said otherwise. The seal on the documents felt like a stamp on the life I had just lost. I turned toward Naomi in the gallery, desperate for some spark of support, but she avoided my eyes. Margaret sat still, her hands folded, her gaze steady, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the start. Paul placed a hand on Deacon's shoulder, a gesture of quiet pride, and Deacon himself didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even glance my way. He simply gathered his papers, thanked his lawyer, and kissed Clara's forehead before leaving the courtroom. His dignity was intact, while mine had crumbled to dust in the silence I had once mocked. Back home, the house felt like a shell. I opened the envelope with the official court ruling, spreading the documents across the table until the words blurred together. Custody, visitation, supervision. My name listed second, his listed first. Clara's name printed again and again, as if reminding me what had slipped through my fingers. I whispered to myself that it was still nothing, that it was just a couch, just one night, just a misunderstanding. But the words tasted sour, broken. The laughter that followed came out jagged, hollow, echoing in the empty house with no one left to hear. I poured myself a glass of wine and wandered into the nursery. The crib was still there, the mobile still hanging, but the silence inside the room was suffocating. No soft cries, no rustling blankets, no small breaths, just absence. I clutched the edge of the crib, whispering that Deacon had stolen her, that he was paranoid, that I was still right. But deep down, I knew it wasn't him who had taken Clara. It was me who had handed her away, one laugh, one lie, one denial at a time. I returned to the living room, staring at the framed family photo on the mantel. Deacon's calm face, Clara's bright smile, and my own laughter frozen in time. I touched the glass, whispering that I had done nothing wrong, that it was just a game, just a joke. But the silence of the house swallowed the words. Deacon had chosen patience over rage, dignity over drama, and in the end, the law had carried his side. My laughter, my twisted logic, my insistence that I had done nothing wrong, those were the very weapons that destroyed me. The house grew darker as the evening set in, and I sat with the papers spread around me, the ink smudging under my fingers. The silence pressed harder, heavier, undeniable. Deacon had walked away with dignity, with Clara, with victory, and I was left with nothing but laughter that no longer sounded like power, only like the echo of a woman who had lost everything. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.